Now we are pleased to hear Professor Funmi Adewole, who is a lecturer in de Montfort University. I don't know if it pronounces it. De Montfort University at Leicester. Is it working? Yes, I think everything's fine. Welcome, Dr. Adewole.
Thank you. I've had a lot of battles with technology in the last few days. My computer disappeared, so my honourable colleague has loaned me his computer, and a friend redid my PowerPoint, so we go. So I'm talking to you this morning about Choregraphy Africana and the philosophies of storytelling. And I'm arguing for the importance of developing an artistic discourse for choreography using African and diaspora forms in the theatre. There's many people working in this area and who have developed critique of this work. However, a dance history has not really emerged, especially within Britain and in Europe, where I work. So this is very much talking from a European space. When you write a dance history, it's very much like storytelling. You're dealing with facts, but you choose what to include and what not to include, depending on the point you're trying to make or what you consider to be valuable. And where I'm from Nigeria, and I grew up in Nigeria, and I live in Britain, and I work and live between these two places. There has always been a suspicion about dance, which we call theatrical dance, and which in America you might call concert dance. There's a suspicion about it. Can African dances of African origin really be theatre dance? We know from anthropology that African dances, traditional dances, they're social, they're ceremonial, they're ritual. And the idea is that when they're taken to stage, they lose that. And therefore, the idea is that they lose their purity and they're no longer real. So there's that kind of debate. There's also an argument that theatre, the idea of theatre or theatre dance is European. So if Africans are trying to do that, are they trying to be westernized? So that is another debate that has been going on. And therefore, choreographers working in this realm, often they are trying to justify why they're working in this space. This is one of the things they try to justify. And they usually justify based on saying, I'm not changing the original form very much. I am trying to be authentic and linking it back, the idea of linking it back to the past. My argument, however, is that traditional forms are also modern forms. And there is a parallel. I would say people working within theatrical dance, they're working in a context which is related but not exactly the same as if you're working within a social, ceremonial or ritual context. Some choreographers go in and out between contexts, and they actually work under different ideas and philosophies within each one. Sometimes they have to have a particular position towards the theatrical context. They do not treat it necessarily as the same place, and if they do, that is a decision they make. One of the arguments against theatre dance is that of modernity. Theatre is supposed to represent modernity. The stage represents modernity. The idea of staging dance is a modern idea. And this idea is supposed to be European, and therefore the forms that have emerged out of a Euro-American context, so let's say classical ballet, or Graham technique, or Cunningham technique, or postmodern movement, they have created a sort of dominant discourse as to what theatrical dance should be. Whereas And therefore, and in that context, forms of dance and techniques of dance have developed which are only used within theatre. You wouldn't go to a club, for example, and find people dancing with each other in a Graham technique-based way. You can, however, see forms that I use in a club. As an African choreographer, I could use the same form on stage. And the idea, therefore, that you haven't created a completely new vocabulary for stage, some people say it's not real. My argument is it's a different form of modernity. And it requires its own story and its own history. There is one area in which theatre dance, I would say theatre dance, Euro-American trajectory of theatre dance and Africanist theatre dance overlap, and that is the area of cultural citizenship. One definition of cultural citizenship is that it refers to the communication-based society that we exist in. That every citizen has a right to communicate and contribute to public discourse and debate. And this is where there is an overlap between theatre coming from different countries and different ideas of modernity. And here, there's a lot of cultural politics as to whose story dominates and which discourse of art becomes dominant. But who tells the stories of choreographers working there? My argument is that we need the history of ideas. We need to know their choreographic approaches, their artistic discourses, their methods of pedagogy. Often these things are omitted. And if we think back to when the first national dance companies were launched in Africa, so we're talking about the late 40s and early 50s, we have at least 50 years of people creating work on stage in different ways. But you rarely see, in my experience, I rarely have had an experience of people handing down their pedagogical tools. And as a result of this, 50 years later, how many books do we have on national dance companies from Africa? Very few. Or their choreographers, or the choreographers. People might argue that we are communal people, and as a communal people, we do not tell the stories of individuals. But these individuals are working with communities. And how they work with communities is important. And as a result of that, we find, because of these ways of thinking, that knowledge which we're producing in this contemporary era is not being documented and not being used. And therefore, our institutions are impoverished as a result of that. This is a quote from an author called Walter Mignolo, and he says, epistemology is not ahistorical. The fact that the idea of theatrical dance might have developed between Europe and America and is considered a European or American way of performing doesn't mean no one else can adopt it and start their own history within it. And so the idea that theatre dance has to be based on techniques which are completely removed or divorced or developed from and abstracted from other forms, that's one person's history of theatre. If we use the national dance companies of Africa, I'm using that as one starting point. There's other starting points of African dance on stage. You can use the colonial era. You can talk of African American choreographers. You can talk of Asadata Dafora Houston, who in the 1930s was using African forms on stage. When people took hold of the theatre to use it, they had political reasons and ideological reasons for doing so. And these reasonings and these philosophies guided in many ways how they choreographed and used the stage. And a history of their activities and work in relation to those politics, I feel, needs to be constructed, so that the theatrical work can be considered on its own terms and in its own right. And so I'm saying choreographic practice is an intervention rather than a dilution. from where I'm coming from, the idea if you work within choreography, you're diluting the forms of dance. But I'm saying that it's actually an intervention into another realm to create a story around our work within civil society and within cultural citizenship and cultural politics. It's not a dilution of the traditional form, because the traditional form is still there and it's still vibrant. Those that people are still performing in it. When I'm in Nigeria, for example, if I go to Ile-Ife, my hometown, people are doing the festivals and the rituals. Some people then might go to Lagos and perform in the National Theatre. These are two parallel things. One is not replacing the other. And both of them have different histories, and that's what I'm saying. So it's an intervention into another section, and it's not a replacement of traditional dance. Some people say many African forms are hybrid anyway. So we have, we say capoeira, for example, it emerged in Africa, it translated to Brazil, it's already hybrid. So what is the hybridity of choreographers? What kind of hybridity are they bringing to production, to the stage? And I'm arguing it is not just the hybridity of mixing forms, but they're also mixing artistic discourses. They're also mixing political ideologies. They are playing around with associations and stereotypes. And as a result of this, they're communicating not only through the form, but through the ideas that are circulating in society about those forms. And they're often coming from a particular spiritual or philosophical position. And this creates the work. So that the hybridities are actually quite different, and in order to critique their work, one has to think along with the discourses they're working with. As I say, my starting point here are the national dance companies of Africa, and I will explain why. When national dance companies began to be established, a great shift happened within the countries. And I recognize this shift from reading histories and from interviewing artistic directors and dancers, and also being in the situation. I was born in Britain, but moved to Nigeria when I was about 7. And at the time, there was a massive festival going on, which was called Festac 77. And Festac 77 brought different countries from Africa to Lagos and from the diaspora. So we had Brazil represented, America represented, the Caribbean represented, and there were dances. And I think this is one of the reasons why I went into theatre, because I spent hours just staring at the television watching all these dances. And as a British-born girl watching all these African dances on television, it blew my mind. But my sister also was one of the performers. She represented our state at the National Theatre, and there's a picture which she shows very proudly of her dressed in traditional wear, holding a horse tail. But what this did was that it created a change in subjectivity. As a Nigerian then, I could go to the theatre and I could see a production which could have dances from the Hausa people, the Igbo people, the Yoruba people, the Bachama people, the Gembu people. There are about 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. The only place I could see all these forms in one production was in the theatre. So the theatre became a place where you could see yourself represented within a national context. Another thing is that people in rural areas or people from families which knew these forms, they could actually start getting work by coming to the urban area to perform the dances. So there was a shift in subjectivity in that dances which were only performed within your community could now actually be performed to an audience who were not related to your community and who would pay for it. So it started to develop the idea of a professional dancer. And as a result of that, culture began to be spoken about differently. In fact, in many respects, culture began to be spoken about as a resource within which you could have social mobility. So someone who did not have a Western education could become a civil servant, because if you were in a national dance company, you could become a civil servant. And so a new space was opened within dance where people could actually participate in national forums and international forums on the basis of knowing traditional dances. And then the whole thing of cultural exchange happened between the diaspora and between Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And so traditional dance, therefore, moved into the idea of the artistic realm of creating work, and a different kind of creativity, not the creativity of which was within the social realm, where everybody understood the story of the dance. And so you created within the rhythm pattern and the language and the understanding and the meaning of the dance. It went into another realm where you were dealing with audiences that didn't understand that way, and maybe audiences that you wanted to speak to in a different way. And so I would say that the idea of choreography as a superstructure of structuring dances started to emerge at this time. There's some people that are writing, actually, that it began to emerge in the 1990s when the French started funding a Pan-African dance competition within the continent. And I would say, no, that modernized the dance industry, but that was not the beginning of modern dance. This was the beginning of a form of modern dance that related to the idea of cultural citizenship, where the idea of nation was placed higher than the idea of the different ethnic groups within a country. And where a company like Les Ballets Africains de Guinée, the African Ballet Company of Guinea, Africa of a country, could exist. And so now coming back to where I'm talking about performance in Europe, a lot of people working with African and diaspora forms within the theatre will describe their work as contemporary dance. It's contemporary dance because they're dealing with contemporary issues, and it's contemporary dance because they're dealing with contemporary cultural politics, and they address these cultural politics in their performance. And they usually argue from the base that the African and diaspora form is expressive enough to work in this way. And I find it useful to use Walter Mignolo's idea of border thinking when looking at their work, because I'm looking at what intersections they are bringing the forms into. And thinking about these intersections gives me ideas about what they're communicating. And so the first person, I'm going to talk about two people briefly. The first person is Thomas Talawa Presto. He is Trinidadian and Norwegian, and he runs a company called the Tabanka Ensemble, and he has developed a technique called the Talawa technique, which is very, very rigorous. It draws on African forms and Caribbean forms. It's strongly Caribbean, and this is actually one of the exercises he does in his dance class, where you put a bottle on your head and walk. But he also gets you to put the bottle on your head, and you wind down and you wind up, and you do all sorts of things balancing the bottle. And I had the opportunity to be invited by the company last week to Oslo, where I watched 3 performances of the same piece, which was called I Object. So it was quite a protest piece in that he was saying I object, but also he was addressing the objectification of the black body. He says his work is very much about the dancing black body. Originally, he had both white and black dancers, but when he began to experience certain types of racism, he felt he needed to make his company all black in order to make the point he wished to get across. At the moment, he has 11 dancers, and he actually went on a TV program that was Norway's Got Talent, and they were runner-up. That's what threw them into the public consciousness, really, was that program. And he works between the commercial and the artistic world. And why their performance last week was so important is that they performed in the dance house. They performed in the Royal Opera House and the dance house, and they're one of the only black companies to get those main stages in the country. In order to contextualize his work, he invited Brenda Dixon Gothschild, who is a renowned scholar, to come and give a public talk about his work. She was also present to do a post-show discussion. It was interesting that the reviewers did not refer, and he also published a magazine explaining his perspective, and he comes from a perspective which he calls Carib futurism. And he's the person who's coined this term, because we usually talk about Afrofuturism, but he's talking about Carib futurism in particular. And it's interesting that the reviewers did not engage with any of his written material. They did not engage with the talk that Brenda Dixon Gothschild did. They did not engage with the post-show talk, the issues that came out there. They did not even take notice the fact that he had standing ovations every night for 3 nights from a mainly, there was a black and white audience, but I would say majority white audience. They ignored all of that and said his work was traditional and lacked innovation. Now, his idea of Carib futurism comes from the fact that he finds Afrofuturism is very much a utopian space, and that the Caribbean body and the Caribbean person and many diasporans are assumed under the idea of Africa. Whilst he is Pan-Africanist, Pan-Africanist in that he draws on ideas and imagery and movement from across the African world, from Africa and the diaspora. He feels that there has to be a space for the Caribbean experience, because he says in the Caribbean, there's not that glorious past that we look back to in the continent, where people will say, we have ancestors who are pharaohs, we have a Kemetic background. He said in the Caribbean, that is not there. The Africans who were enslaved and taken to the Caribbean, they start their story from that point of fighting slavery. However, he says that history is a teacher and great wisdom has emerged from the Caribbean society as a result. And the future that the Caribbean is creating is from that wisdom. And that's what he calls Carib futurism. Now, what I'm going to do, because I've had so much problem with the computer, I'll take the presentation to the end and then see if I can go back and show some clips of the work, because I'm afraid to stop it and the whole thing falls apart and doesn't start again. The next person I want to talk about briefly is Alexandra Soutine. Now, Alexandra, if you look at her, is mixed race. Her dad is blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and her mother is from Zimbabwe. And that experience has really impacted on her. She identifies very strongly with her African identity, but she is European, Belgium as well. And so she calls herself an Afropean. And the idea of interplay between African styles and European styles is where the term Afropean emerged. But when you look at her work, I feel what I'm seeing is someone saying within the African aesthetic and African principles, there is everything you need to navigate every space, including the European space. And so the piece I'm talking about 2 artists that have entered mainstream stages. She premiered a piece of work recently called Boy Breaking Glass, which is the title of a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks. and she premiered that at Sadler's Wells. And it was a big deal because in Sadler's Wells, I don't think they put Black British, they put Ailey, Dancer of Harlem, on the main stages, but very rarely Black British artists go on the main stages because the work is not considered to be of that standard or broad enough in its outlook to encompass, to interest a large audience. So this piece went on stage. Again, it was given by the mainstream press 2 stars. They said bold new voice fails to pack a punch. Again, ignoring the fact that there were standing ovations from a mixed multiracial audience for 2 nights, and that there was a Q&A in which the artist was able to talk about her work. What is interesting about Alexandra, she works in a very eclectic way. She's a protege of Jamin Okoye. She's one of the 17 people that have studied the technique completely. I think the only one in Britain. And also she's working in this piece a lot with the Sabar dance. And she moves, and what she does is she works with Sabar as we know Sabar, but she also shows the skill base and technical base in Sabar that can carry it through space and make it quite geometric. So I will also show a clip of her work. Whilst critics were debating about how much tradition or how much modernity were in these people's work, I would argue that their work is a dialogue between the idea of modernity and tradition. And it's guided by the philosophy, the artistic philosophy that they take, whether it's Afrofuturism, Carib futurism, or Afropeanism. It's not, they don't see modernity as a linear and tradition as a linear thing, as tradition stops here and modernity takes off. It's not the same relationship between tradition and modernity. Because, for example, how would you describe a masquerade? There's a masquerade in Igbo land in Nigeria. And the role of that masquerade for the last, as far as we can remember, so let's just say 500 years, is to show what the young people are doing. So this masquerade will come and dance around the village once a year, displaying what the young people are up to. And so it was observed in the 1980s, this masquerade started breakdancing. Do we say this masquerade has become modern? Because actually this masquerade is doing what it has done for the last 500 years, which just shows what young people are doing. It hasn't switched its role. So the fact that he's doing something modern, people will argue it's traditional. And I think I will take that point of view at all. It's a different thing from someone going to observe the masquerade and then going back to the theatre and creating the theatre piece based on the masquerade. And then we have situations where the masquerade is invited to come and perform in the theatre. And people might do rights because it's going out of its original context to perform in another context. Has it become modern? So when you have these kind of negotiations within performance within Africa, how someone relates to tradition and modernity is very different from a linear idea of going from the Greeks up to the northern knowledge production. It's not this kind of straight line. And these practitioners do not work in that way. And how they work is also formed by the political situations and cultural situations they experience within Europe. And so there are 3 sides of story that I'm interested in, and that's the socio-political context of the artist, the artist standpoint, and the critic standpoint. Because the critic has to come to understand that the history of theatre dance is not a straight line. It's a network of stories. And some people's stories are cutting across others. And the fact that I might be using some European form in my piece, I'm actually taking that form into my story. And since I'm taking it into my story, it is expressing my idea. Just like Picasso took ideas from African sculpture into his idea of modern art. It didn't become African, it's still Picasso. And therefore, we have to look at dance history as a network of stories rather than one one particular story, and black people are trying to get into this white Euro-American story. That's not the destination. So having said, I'll see if I can quickly play some video without, and see if it works. Sorry. Cancel. Okay. Retransfer. So this is from a rehearsal of Boy Breaking Glass. Is that it? Oh God, what have I done? I wish I hadn't touched it. I was trying to make it better. I'll leave it alone. We have no volume. Oh. So that was a clip of Boy Breaking Glass, and then I'm going to try and get a clip of, see if I can get something from Thomas. Oh, okay. Make it bigger.
There's no image at all.
Oh.
Free man. I sung songs of free man. My mother, chained to them I cried.
Il faudrait déjà mettre l'image.
We can't get the picture. I'll try another one. Oh. Do you think I should play during the question and answer session?
Oh, yeah. If you can.
Yeah. Okay, just because I can't get it to come up, I'll go back and play around with the computer, and during the Q&A, I will show a clip of Thomas's production. Thank you for listening.